Stay with us. We've got lots more coming up here on Sky News Real Estate, including an auction not that far away now, about 10 minutes to go till we are going to be live in Fullerton in Adelaide. So just 3 kilometres from the CBD of Adelaide. So great property there. Looking forward to that one. Now, though, many of us love the idea of building our dream home, or at least rolling up the sleeves to renovate what we already own. But with the extension of a deck or the raising of a roof comes a certain amount of potentially confusing red tape. Well, joining us now to break down the rules surrounding building approvals is Jeremy Streten from Streten Masons Lawyers. Jeremy, great to see you. Thanks so much for coming on the show again and providing us with some advice and tips around what we need to know. The process of attaining building approvals, what are some of the traps that people sometimes fall into?
Yeah, thanks for having me on again, Brody. So probably the biggest trap is not knowing what they actually need to get. So you don't know what you don't know. There are really complicated rules about what renovation work needs to be approved. It's mainly renovation work that's the problem. So building new homes don't really, most people know they need to get approval for those. But what we see is we see a lot of people who renovate their homes and they don't realise that they need to get an approval from their local council for that work. So we see that quite a bit, and it's actually a huge problem.
I think it would flow on naturally for buyers and sellers. How does it affect them when it comes to that, exchange of contract time?
Yeah, well, that's a great question, and the biggest issue comes down to what they're actually buying. So if you're a buyer, you want to make sure that what you're buying is all approved, because the council can come along and knock down houses if works are done that aren't approved. That is an extreme case, but from a buyer's point of view, you want to make sure that all the time that what you're buying is approved. And what we've found happens is often sellers don't know that their property isn't approved, and what we're talking about here is they apply to get the council approval, they get it, but then when that work's actually completed, they never actually go and get it certified. So what we've found is that last step isn't done, and when that last step isn't done, they find that when they go to sell the property, the solicitor does a search. They find that the certification for the property was never actually completed, and it comes up on the search, and sometimes that can be 10, 15 years after the work's actually been done, and it can be very hard to find the person who actually was supposed to certify the work to get it done and submit it to the council.
So so it's up to you, the owner too, not the builder, to organise all of this, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, the obligation is on you, the property owner, to get that done. But in my experience, any builder worth their salt won't do work that might need approval without making sure that if it does need approval, that you actually have got it. So, really, it's incumbent on both the property owner and the builder to make sure that what's been done is actually properly approved.
Now, what's some of the specific work that needs to be done that can give us an example for people what needs to be checked?
Yeah, so I'll give an example of something that doesn't need to be approved, and that would be a simple, say you've got an existing bathroom and you want to renovate that. That won't need an approval. But if you're going to add on a new bathroom, then often that does need approval because you might be adding an extra toilet or a sink, and so there needs to be approval to make sure that what you're adding on actually does that there's capacity to meet those what you're putting in. The other one is major structural work. So if you're raising roofs or putting on decks or extending houses, then sometimes yes, carports do need them, especially if they're enclosed. They'll need approvals as well.
So how do you find all this out? Are the rules different depending on where you are?
Yes, absolutely. So there's state-based legislation, and then each council within each state has their own rules. So you really need to speak to usually a town planner is the best person to speak to, because they deal with this all day, every day, and they can tell you what you need to know.
Is it a costly process? Is it something that renovators need to put into their budget to allow for?
Oh, absolutely. It's usually around a few $1,000s if it's a simple application. But if you need to make submissions or get reports, so if you're in Brisbane, for example, if your property is too close to the boundary and you want to extend that wall, then that wall needs to meet certain fire safety codes, and that can be quite a costly report to get that put in place so that it meets the requirements of the codes.
So what's the actual process? So firstly, you need to make sure you get approval before the work is done, and then you need to make sure what the certification is done after that. Can you just take us through the actual process?
Sure, yeah. So, the first step is you've got to determine whether or not what you want to do actually needs approval. So that's where your best port of call is a town planner. Then you would make the application to council. You'd provide them with documentation. They always ask questions in my experience, so you've got to respond to that. Then the builder does the work, and then a private certifier is normally engaged to certify that the works that have been done are appropriate and should be approved. Normally the councils don't come out and do their own approvals. They will take the word of a private certifier to actually get it done. And it's that last step that, in my experience, especially in southeast Queensland, has been a big problem, that the private certifier hasn't been engaged to do the final certificate, and where they haven't actually given it on to the council. And sometimes it can be 10, 20 years later and you find out that that was never done.
Yeah, so they're buying something that's legally approved with a tick, but just hasn't been finalised to make sure it was done correctly, right?
That's right. That's right. But but in other cases, and I've seen this happen quite often too, that no approval was ever obtained, and the council can actually make them pull down that property if that
Goes
renovation
from a 4-bedroom to a 2-bedroom.
In the extreme examples.
Yeah. So the ramifications, the penalties then for, say, you put on a deck, you didn't end up getting the certification. What can happen? I mean, how can council find out?
Well, council can find out by a neighbour making a complaint. That happens quite often because all the approval searches are found online, so people can find out whether or not your works have been approved. Sometimes there are council officers who drive around and have a look. And what can happen is, in extreme cases, they can require it to be pulled down. So that's normally where work's done that wouldn't have been approved anyway. So it's not an area where you do it and then beg for forgiveness later. That doesn't work. As in some other areas of the law, you might be able to do that, but in this you can't. So often you can be fined as well. The builder can actually be fined. How much are those
fines? I mean, obviously your remit's Queensland, but what are the fines like?
Well, the fines can be anything from a few $100s to thousands of dollars, depending on how deliberate what you're doing was, whether or not you should have known, how intentional, and how much work was actually undertaken. So really, the fines are, the maximum fines are tens of thousands of dollars, but that usually doesn't happen. They're usually quite small to start with. But if you have a track record of not getting the works approved, then they can be quite large.
Yeah. I'm wondering, we're getting a state where some people are stuck in the sad position of looking after a deceased estate from like a relative. What can they do to they can visually look at the property, see if something looks new, but like you said, it might be 10 years old. Where can they go to confirm that information and find out that everything is approved?
That's a great question. So the short answer is to the local council, find out whether or not approval was obtained. And if it wasn't, then you go back to the people who did the work and ask them to give the certification. If you can't find them, or if they've unfortunately passed away, or if they've stopped in their business and moved away, then you would have to get another certifier to come in to certify that what was done is approved, and that can be quite costly because that's actually quite risky for the certifier who wasn't involved with it at the time.
And time as well, would that be a lengthy process?
It can be a lengthy process, especially if you need to get another certifier in. It can be quite a lengthy process. And the problem that we see happens is when people sign contracts and then they find out halfway through the contract, in Queensland you might have a 30-day contract, and they find out on the 20th day that something wasn't approved, and the seller's running around trying to get all the approvals put in place, and that can be quite stressful and take a bit of time. And
it's so interesting. Jeremy, thanks for explaining all that for us. Really appreciate it.
Thank you very much for having me.
Jeremy Streten there from Streten Masons Lawyers, and also the author of The Business Legal Life Cycle. All right, we're going to take a quick break. Coming up after that, we're going to head to Adelaide for our next auction.